Hello and welcome to ISEAL Sustainability Podcast. I'm Cherika Kusuma and I'm your host for this episode. Today we are taking a deep dive into traceability and chain of custody, why they matter and what they mean for the industry. I'm joined by my colleague Josh Taylor, ISEAL's Traceability Manager, who will help us explore the topic from the inside. Before we get into the topic, Josh, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you. Can you share a little bit about your role and also your work in traceability?
Sure. So I currently manage ISEAL's work on all things chain of custody and traceability. And in this role, it means I'm working closely with my colleagues in ISEAL's policy team, tracking developments around regulation that requires increasing levels of traceability, and also with colleagues in our impact and innovations team, working in looking at how traceability can support various sustainability objectives and outcomes. So great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, let's start with the very basic. When people hear the term traceability, they often think of tracking products from point A to point B. Am I right? And how would you describe it in the simplest way?
Sure, happily. So traceability is a bit of a buzzword, and people use it a lot, and they use it to mean quite different things. So ISEAL defined traceability as a way of knowing where the raw materials in a product comes from, who is involved in production and trade of those materials, and also a bit of context and information about the manufacturing of that product through the supply chain. So traceability is really about knowing who's in your supply chain, what's involved in your supply chain and what's coming in terms of material, where material is being produced, where it's being manufactured, and context around why it's being produced and manufactured as well, and how. Now, for companies, traceability comes with lots of different benefits, depending on the way that you approach traceability and also depending on the context that you're operating in. So we see for companies, particularly operating in the food space, that traceability can really help with improved quality control. In food safety, traceability is really just a key pillar. If a number of people show up in a hospital with severe food poisoning from salmonella, it turns out that they all bought the same salad from the same store, then it's in everyone's interest to be able to work out who produced that salad and figure out where the contamination happened and put in place measures to stop it happening again. And that's really only possible when there is traceability in that supply chain. Traceability, it's also really beneficial because for companies it can support with cost reduction. It can mean that they are being more efficient with the materials that they're sourcing and that they're using. And it comes with a broad range of other operational efficiencies as well. Where we see traceability really growing in importance and relevance in the supply chain is in the context of sustainability and ESG reporting, being able to say where the materials or products that you're sourcing come from, and to be able to report on the sustainability performance or ESG risk associated with that materials or products, and also increasingly in the domain of regulatory compliance. We're seeing a whole bunch of things coming in the pipeline from the EU and other countries requiring increasing levels of traceability in the supply chain. And I'm looking forward to digging into that more in this podcast.
Okay, so just to recap, traceability improves efficiency, cut cost, and supports compliance. But how does the chain of custody come into play in this process?
So you can have traceability systems that track materials forward through the supply chain. You can also have traceability approaches that trace materials back to their source. These different approaches, they come with different strengths and weaknesses, different levels of granularity and the like. Now, chain of custody, it's a type of traceability, and it's a way of enabling traceability through complex supply chains. And it's a type of traceability that goes forward through the supply chain, from production through to the end consumer. And we define chain of custody at ISEAL as a means of tracking inputs, outputs, and associated attributes as they move forward through the supply chain. It sounds jargony, but it's ultimately about being able to say how material were handled and also how data associated what a company has sourced or purchased is then associated with what they're selling on.
Right. Okay. Speaking of chain of custody, ISEAL recently released a revised version of the chain of custody models guidance. What are the main changes compared to the previous version, and why should business pay attention to this?
So when we initially produced our original guidance on chain of custody, it was as a support document for our claims good practice guidance. In back then, chain of custody was really of most interest to people, particularly in the sustainability space, because it really underpinned what kind of claims a company could make about their sourced certified materials or products. The context has changed a lot since then. So we see a lot more interest in chain of custody for so many different purposes and reasons. We see actors still interested in chain of custody to enable claims, and with the increasing regulation around claims, chain of custody is now more important than ever. But we also see chain of custody being particularly relevant in the context of regulation. So we see regulation like the EU deforestation regulation that really calls out what different chain of custody models can be used to support compliance. And we also see reporting frameworks like SBTI also making reference to chain of custody in terms of what can count towards companies' net zero performance and what can't count towards that. So each of these different areas, we're talking about chain of custody completely differently. And this is problematic because, one, it causes confusion. People aren't speaking with a shared language. But two, we're ultimately talking about the same material that's being controlled by chain of custody for different purposes. And if we want to try to reduce complexity for supply chain organizations, if we want to make things more streamlined so we can get away from complexity towards implementation, then we really need to be able to speak with a shared and common language. So we set out to revise our chain of custody guidance in July 2024. There is a lot more content now just explaining what chain of custody is, how it can be designed, and ways of differentiating between different chain of custody models. We also updated our model definitions for each of the different models. We introduced a new model into the guidance as well, one called controlled mass balance, which we can get onto more in just a bit. And we also look to align language wherever possible with external standards like ISO, because they also have guidance on chain of custody. For the geeks out there listening, it's 22095. And again, we didn't want to look to add more complexity by having different definitions, different concepts out there.
That's really great to hear because more clarity and language consistency is exactly what we need. What pushed this update forward though? You mentioned about new regulations, and what about the growing consumers' expectations or other market factors?
Yeah, of course. So chain of custody, it really underpins the kind of claims that can be made about a certified product. And we know full well that consumers are expecting increasing transparency and information about the materials that they're sourcing. They want to know whether there's certified material in the products that they're sourcing. I think it's fair to assume that if they see a label, they would assume that there would be certified materials in the products that they're sourcing. And that's not necessarily always the case, depending on the chain of custody model used. So we need to be really clear about what different models mean in terms of what's in the final product. And also, I guess, what you kind of claims companies can make with these different COC models, because ultimately we don't want to enable greenwashing. We need greater transparency and to help consumers make the right decisions in what they're purchasing.
All right, it's starting to get a bit technical now. Could you unpack the models a little more and explain the differences between the chain of custody models?
Sure. So I mentioned that not all chain of custody systems mean that you have certified materials in the end product, and that sounds confusing. So just to dig a bit more into that, because I think it's quite relevant for this discussion and something that we really expanded on in our guidance. There are different chain of custody models that will have different controls in place. So some chain of custody models, they do not allow certified materials to be mixed with non-certified materials. So that's models that are called identity preservation and segregation. We also, though, have a number of models that allow mixing of certified and non-certified materials in the supply chain. There's one called controlled blending, where you can say the percentage of certified material that's in the product. So maybe it's 60% certified content. That's something that's often used in the textile space. But then there are also models which are called, go under the banner of mass balance, where you can have mixing of certified and non-certified materials, and where you don't necessarily know if there's certified material in the output that's being sold on. You just know that the volume that's being sold on as mass balance represents a volume of certified material sourced. So you know that under a mass balance model, there isn't more certified material being sold than is sourced, but you don't know if it's necessarily in the final products. And it sounds counterintuitive to have this model, but really it reflects the complexity of supply chains and manufacturing processes. And it ultimately enables the flow of attributes through supply chains when really kind of strong, strict traceability isn't possible. I think what you should expect from a chain of custody system in terms of credibility will ultimately really depend on what you need the chain of custody system for. So that's both in terms of the claims that you're looking to make through the chain of custody system, and also how that data tracked through the system will be used. So if the chain of custody system is being set up to support regulatory compliance, for example, then you need to make sure that the chain of custody system is aligned with what's required in the regulation. So under the EUDR, they've got quite strict rules about segregation of deforestation-free and legally produced material, and keeping that separate from unknown material or high-risk material. And they also have quite stringent requirements around the kind of level of information that needs to be tracked through the supply chain with that material. So if you're wanting to use a chain of custody system to support your regulatory compliance in that context, it's really critical that it's aligned to what's in the regulation. If we're moving away from that regulatory context towards thinking about just if you want a system that tracks physical volumes of certified material, then it's really important that there's controls and checks in place within the supply chain to make sure that material isn't being mixed or substituted, or that volumes aren't being inflated as well. So I think regardless though of the model, regardless of the use case, there are some fundamentals that we should expect. The first of those fundamentals is really that there is clear volume reconciliation in place. So by that, I mean accounting measures and ways of making sure that you don't have more stuff leaving the system than was entering into it. So that means making sure that, and this starts at the very start of the supply chain, making sure that there isn't more certified material being produced than and being sold on than was produced. Making sure that when a supplier purchases a certain volume, that they can't sell on more than that volume to the next party in the supply chain. So this volume reconciliation is really, really key. It can be quite challenging to enforce because just again, the complexity of the supply chain. But it's really critical that it's something that we get right. The other thing that's really fundamental is around kind of clear requirements within the chain of custody. So being really clear with your suppliers and with the supply chain about what's expected of them and what they should be doing. So if it's really unclear what they should be doing, then that will really undermine the effectiveness of the chain of custody system. And then again, just another fundamental alignment between the chain of custody model being used and the claims that are enabled through that system. So if you want to make a claim that something contains certified material, then you need to make sure that you're using chain of custody models that allow you to back up that claim. If you just want to make a claim that you're supporting certified production, well, you can look to different chain of custody models then to support that. So it's nuanced, but these are some of the key fundamentals that I'd expect from any chain of custody system.
Right. So there are several chain of custody models, and companies need to select the one that best fits their operations. Got it. But regardless of the model, though, what are the key factors to get right to ensure that the system is truly credible?
So I think there's two parts to this. There's the application of and the way that chain of custody can support GHG accounting. And then there's also like how companies can apply chain of custody models generally, right? So if we look at the GHG accounting piece first, we're seeing increasing interest in using chain of custody to support corporate GHG accounting and reporting. And chain of custody, and particularly our guidance on chain of custody, is really being used to help distinguish between what can be counted by a company when it comes to their physical GHG inventory. So that's your scope 1, your scope 2, and most importantly, I think for chain of custody, your scope 3. And what should be reported outside of it, what you can't say is within your value chain. So chain of custody models that support the physical tracking of materials, so your identity preservation, your segregation, your controlled blending, they all clearly help and contribute and can be counted towards the company's physical inventory. We're also seeing some nuance where some types of mass balance can also be used in some contexts to be counted towards physical inventory. So greenhouse gas protocol are now in their land sector removal standard have said that mass balance that is batch level or site level can support and can count towards this physical inventory as well. So it's quite an exciting time at the minute for this. And we're seeing companies looking more and more towards chain of custody systems to deliver this information that they wouldn't otherwise get. In terms of implementing then, this is where it's important to, where possible, work with an established sustainability system. Because for an end company wanting to implement chain of custody across their supply chain, it's going to be a really heavy lift because of the level of coordination, because of the level of engagement that's required. Whereas working through an established sustainability system, where you have thousands of suppliers that are certified to the chain of custody standards, that are participating in the program, that are trained and that are understand how they can source certified materials according to different chain of custody and how they can sell that material on, will really streamline your ability as a company to source materials through a chain of custody.
It seems like a lot of work went on in the background. Could you maybe talk us through how this new guidance was created and how does it align with the credibility principles?
Sure. So it's a really good question. So in terms of process, as ever, we try to apply a robust public consultation process to the development of the guidance. So, we don't just want to talk the talk, we also want to walk the walk. So as part of the guidance revision process, we ran call for inputs, we set up multi-stakeholder expert groups, we ran a 2-month public consultation, and we also look to respond and resolve all the comments that we received as part of that. So I think just in terms of the nature of the guidance, it's been developed through a multi-stakeholder process and followed good practice in that regard. In terms of alignment to the credibility principles, I think chain of custody itself it has strong links to many of the credibility principles. So chain of custody requires collaboration between business actors to make it a success. And as sustainability systems develop chain of custody systems, it's really important that there is collaboration of different actors who would be involved in the chain of custody in that development process to ensure that the chain of custody system is fit for purpose, that it's practical, and that it's implementable. What we should never look to do is to develop systems that actors in the supply chain can't use. So collaboration is really critical. Another of the credibility principles that is very much at the core of chain of custody is value creation. Chain of custody ultimately represents work for the supply chain and those who are sourcing, handling, and selling certified materials. So we need to make sure that there is value creation and benefit for those actors in participating in the chain of custody. Other credibility principles that seem quite paramount and relate quite closely to traceability and chain of custody relate to transparency, reliability, and truthfulness. So it's really critical that these systems aren't just paper-based systems and that they reflect what's happening within the supply chain, that we can trust the claims that flow through chain of custody systems, and that there's transparency in how these systems are implemented as well.
Okay, but sorry to stop you here. How does it align with the code?
So the ISEAL code, it applies to all scheme components and strategies that will contribute to or result in a scheme's sustainability outcomes, or that back up the claims and communications being made about the results. So that means that a scheme's chain of custody is in the scope of the ISEAL code. So we have references to chain of custody throughout the code, and we also have a specific requirement on chain of custody in the code. And that's that the scheme's owner's approach to chain of custody is sufficient to prevent fraud and is appropriate for the types of claims that it allows. So again, this really goes back to what are we trying to use the chain of custody for? And following that, what do we need to have in place in the chain of custody system to deliver on those outcomes as well?
Okay, so you just touched on claims, and maybe let's dig into that a bit more. How can companies use chain of custody models to, say, strengthen their GHG accounting? And how can they also use it to make their claims more credible?
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned about one of the new models that we've introduced into the guidance compared to the previous guidance, and that model is the controlled mass balance model. So just to explain it, it's a model that we see of a growing importance. You can still have mixing of certified and non-certified materials. You don't necessarily know if the output that you've sourced through the controlled mass balance model is certified or contains certified material or not, but all of the material entering into the mix meets minimum levels in terms of sustainability or legal requirements. So in the context of EUDR, if it's a controlled mass balance approach that's aligned to EUDR, you might not know if the material that you sourced is certified, but you can have confidence that the material, whether certified or not, met the requirements of the EUDR. That's the deforestation status of the material has been checked, that the compliance of legal compliance of production has been checked as well. So this model, we're seeing a lot of interest in it. We're seeing it already applied within the ISEAL community by the likes of FSC and the Sustainable Biomass Program. And we're seeing other members introducing it in response to EUDR, where they work in supply chains where it's not possible to necessarily keep your certified stuff separate from your non-certified stuff. And our guidance has helped build some alignment and clarity around this model. And we're now seeing increasingly business associations looking to provide guidance and to even set requirements around a controlled mass balance approach with their industry members. So we have some good examples of industry associations like AIC, who are developing their own chain of custody requirements and responsible sourcing standards, where they're now using ISEAL chain of custody guidance, particularly using our guidance on controlled mass balance as the basis for their requirements as well. And that's ultimately helping companies meet requirements in the regulation and also navigate some of the complexity that comes with trying to implement or apply traceability approaches generally.
What are some of the challenges or limitations in implementing chain of custody systems? And for the businesses, what should they be mindful of?
Yeah, as with everything, there are limitations. So in terms of limitations, I think it's important to really highlight that chain of custody systems, they don't solve all of the issues or provide all of the traceability related data that companies increasingly need for regulation. So chain of custody, it can work for the EUDR, for example, because in the context of EUDR, the compliance requirements and the sustainability requirements are at production. The material needs to be produced deforestation free and also produced legally according to the kind of law of the country of production. That attribute, that it's deforestation free, that it's legally produced, that can be, I'm not going to say easily, but at least it's suited to transfer through a chain of custody system. You then have other regulation, so like the EU forced labor regulation, which requires checks across and kind of due diligence across the supply chain, not just at production. And a traditional chain of custody system that's tracking material and tracking attributes associated with that material isn't necessarily going to serve up the same level of information that you need to support compliance with forced labor regulation. So again, devil's in the details, and it's important to understand really what you want from a chain of custody system to assess if it's the right pick. The other limitation or challenge is, of course, nothing is foolproof. So supply chains are long, they're complex, they're opaque. Traceability, everybody's wanted to do traceability for I don't know how long, but no one's really been able to achieve it at scale because of the complexity of the task at hand. So while chain of custody systems should have monitoring and verification in place, there should be audits, there should be procedures to control the integrity, assess compliance. Nothing is foolproof. So that's also why continual monitoring and also having a feedback mechanism where if issues are identified, actions can be taken to address those issues is really paramount.
Chain of custody does not solve all the problems. Well noted, Josh. Okay, now looking ahead, how might these models evolve further? Like what innovations could, say, reshape how we track and verify sustainable business practices?
Yeah, so I think one trend that we expect to really accelerate in the coming years is around the use of digital tools to track chain of custody. And that's where we start seeing almost a merger between chain of custody as it is today with more digital traceability and tracking tools. So today, sustainability systems use digital tools to really track volumes that are purchased and sold through the supply chain. So we've got some great examples within the community of the likes of Better Cotton, say, with the Better Cotton platform. All purchases of Better Cotton orders for mass balance or for physical, they all go through the Better Cotton platform. So that allows you to track on aggregate the volumes of material purchased and the volumes sold. Again, it's this controller and volumes that's really fundamental across all chain of custody systems. And it's not just Better Cotton who do it. The RSPO have quite well-established systems, Rainforest Alliance, Fairtrade, Sustainable Biomass Program. Many of our members have these. And as technology continues to become more advanced and more accessible, we can expect that these tools to improve and to capture and to transfer more granular levels of data and to also make it easier to use the systems and the tools in the first place. So really lowering the barrier towards participation and getting more granular in the traceability data that's transferred. I mentioned a bit about just the challenges with the complexity and that it's impossible to have checks on everything going through a system. I think there is also some real innovation happening around use of AI and use of maybe automated checks, for lack of a better word, on data coming into systems that will help strengthen the integrity of data and ultimately address and reduce any potential fraud that's happening within the system. So I think the future's bright in terms of opportunities around innovation and in terms of traceability generally.
I really appreciate ending on an optimistic note. So digitalization and AI will definitely improve these systems in the near future. Now, just one final question. Where can our listeners find the Chain of Custody publication and learn more?
What a good question. Well, let me tell you, the ISEAL guidance is available on the ISEAL website. And I think we can put a link in the notes for this podcast, depending on how you're accessing it. In addition to the guidance itself, we're also in the process of publishing some worked examples of how chain of custody looks in different supply chains. So I think this is a nice additional visual resource to help our listeners understand what chain of custody is. We've also been developing some supplemental guidance and some related guidance on chain of custody and how it can be used in different contexts, including guidance that we produced at the end of October in collaboration with the Value Change Initiative, which really zooms in on how chain of custody can be used to support physical traceability in the context of GHG accounting. So if you get excited by chain of custody and if you get excited by greenhouse gas accounting, then I think this is the bedtime reading you need. So again, we can share the links in the notes.
Thank you for tuning in to the ISEAL Sustainability Podcast. You can find more resources at www.isealalliance.org, and we hope to see you in the next episode.